Really appreciate it. And it's very exciting to be here presenting to the La Trobe History Seminar since, as Claudia noted, I am an interloper coming to you from anthropology. And this kind of project that I'll be presenting today is part of my kind of wider project on financialization in Latin America, focusing on Paraguay. And the most recent project coming out of my DECRA research is looking at insurance. So that's kind of gripping topic. Will not be the focus today, much to your, I'm sure, kind of a great kind of relief. But the book project itself does have a snappy title. It's called Parametric Planet, and it's on parametric insurance, which is this essentially a weather derivative that's now being sold to small farmers in the context of climate financing and environmental damage, weather disasters. So what I'll be presenting today kind of looks back at a long history of financialization in kind of Paraguay, its entanglement with imperial finance in the mid to late 19th century, and what that can tell us about the production of land as an asset class, different theories of ownership and property in Latin America and beyond. So I think the seminar, I'm worried, is a bit long, so I might kind of run over the 45 minutes to hopefully not more than 55 minutes, but I'll dive right in so that I can give you all the juicy details of kind of debt and default in the late 19th century. So Paraguayan post-independence socioeconomic history might, at very first glance, appear to typify processes of colonial frontier expropriation. Indeed, dispossession, see if I can get the next slide, there we go, has been mobilized by scholarship on land grabbing as a broad macro-historical process related to the specific territorial acquisition logic of settler colonialism. And here, this is thinking with Robert Nichols. And this has taken a central role in debates about empire, racial capitalism, slavery, and its afterlives,
Sorry,
and indigenous sovereignty.
Can I just interrupt? I don't think our slides are progressing. I can
you're not
see
seeing your slides. Oh no.
Well, I can still see the first one, and the bar on the left, but nothing has advanced.
Weird.
I think you might have presenter view on.
Yeah, I hope not. Share screen. See if we can share that now.
Oh,
That's
that
better.
looks good.
Does that go? Okay, hopefully I can keep this going. And if not, let me know. And so I'll see if I can reset it. Right, so the kind of critical theorists identify this dilemma at the heart of property frontier logics. Either, and this is Nichols again, either one claims prior possession of the land in a recognizable property form, thus universalizing and backdating a general possessive logic as the appropriate normative benchmark, or one disavows possession as such, apparently undercutting the force of a subsequent claim of dispossession. And this is what Nichols calls the liberal bind. It suggests that property, frontier property, is, according to his analysis, a process that presupposes what it entails. In his view, instead of an impasse, locating frontier property logics within specific historical processes would view recursive dispossession as effectively a form of property generating theft. So this formulation, property generating theft, opens a series of concerns about what precisely was entailed in the property regime that came into being in the crucible of British imperial finance in the mid and late 19th century. Indeed, the complex and contingent forms of ownership that emerged at the interface between the London Stock Exchange and Paraguayan land occupancy suggests that the conceptual bind of dispossession is not nearly as much of a closed loop as it might first appear. Ownership, it would seem, is a category that created considerable trouble for itself, both in London and in Asunción. In what follows, I explore a particularly, oh, sorry, that's the kind of slide that you kind of should have seen in my kind of semi-flustered kind of advance of the slide deck. Here we go, it's the outline of the talk. In what follows, I explore a particularly cruel and flagrant moment of dispossession orchestrated through 19th century Latin American land speculation on British capital markets, and attempt to tease out the theory of ownership at its heart. The specific process of dispossession in Paraguay rendered public land into private estates, then into property, into then a financial asset class, and finally into sovereign debt. Throughout, struggles over ownership were powerfully coupled to the spatial logics of empire, in the sense that the newly minted system of extractive commodity agriculture and capitalist land tenure took shape in the Americas and provided the conditions of possibility for specific forms of ownership, even as the dominant European feudal system was coming apart at the seams. So my aim here is to deal specifically with one dynamic that I think is potentially unique to this financial frontier in Paraguay. That is the precise way in which settlement figures in a process of dispossession. And here I mean to imply settlements in its double sense of occupation and contractual closure through liquidation. The two conditions of settlement, so we have kind of territorial opening on the one hand and financial closure on the other hand, emerge in dynamic tension. This observation has implications for how we theorize the specific settler colonial regimes under conditions of racial capitalism. And I know this is a lot of theory-heavy throat clearing, so I hope this becomes a lot clearer as I work through Paraguay's financial archive. So onward to debt dependency and the Latin American left. In a remarkable episode in Paraguayan economic history, the pendulum swung in the mid-19th century from total economic insularity and independence to extreme economic dependence. The fulcrum of this swing was the geopolitically crucial War of the Triple Alliance in Latin America's southern cone. And if there's some Latin Americanists in the audience, I'd be delighted to speak more of this. So it's from 1865 to 1870. And this pitted Paraguay against a vastly superior military coalition comprised of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And we kind of could anticipate how this ends based on the kind of asymmetry of that conflict. In a documentary film about the War of the Triple Alliance, Argentine film director Jose Luis Garcia tracked the enduring legacies of Paraguay's defeat at the hands of its politically dominant and economically powerful neighbors. The film, Cándido López, Los Campos de Batalla, from 2006, draws inspiration from the paintings of a soldier in the Argentine campaign, Lieutenant Cándido López, and you can see one of his paintings here, depicting the decisive battles of the first half of the war before López was returned to Buenos Aires upon losing his right arm in the Battle of Curupaytú in Paraguay's agrarian north. Traveling through the countryside and up the rivers and estuaries in search of the landmarks of significant battlefields captured in Cándido López's paintings, this film crew sort of retraced the path of Paraguayan defeat, ending in the isolated peripheral forest preserve in the Paraguayan Chaco, where Mariscal Francisco Solano López, the military and political leader of Paraguay, was ultimately hunted down and killed by alliance forces in 1870, uttering his famous last words, "I die with my country." The historical legacy of the War of the Triple Alliance is not simply a question of documenting the enduring trauma that unspooled from Solano López's parting lament. Indeed, the film concludes with a long discussion between a British commentator whose historical fiction dealt with Solano López's family and the Argentinian director. Rather than linger on the militarized violence of the alliance's territorial expansion, they focused on the economic principles that animated the conflict. And this is why I'm sort of dealing with this here. It's a curious place to end a film about the collective memory of the war in Paraguay. Filmed while exploring the wreck of a British gunboat purchased by the Allied forces during the conflict, the scene captures the novelist's detached surprise and bemusement when she learned that many scholars of Latin America implicate British commercial interests in the conflict. While Latin American countries gained their independence from Spain and Portugal in the first decades of the 19th century, British commercial and financial interests were quick to make deals with the newly independent states. Thus, when asked if England had any direct interest in the war, the novelist answered, "Well, I think that sooner or later Paraguay would have to change, because every other country in the world, in the developed and developing world, was becoming more sophisticated in its financial arrangements. And if you want to have international commerce, you have to have international finance. And Paraguay was very proud of the fact that she had no foreign debts, which is a good thing. But if you have no foreign debts, you also have no foreign credits, and you have no existing arrangements. The film director interjected, but they didn't need it, kind of debt. The novelist retorted that, well, but during the war, they definitely needed it, implying that Paraguay's catastrophic defeat came partially due to its inability to finance the war autochtonously. And this view is widely held in scholarly literature on Paraguayan history. Indeed, many sources remark on Paraguay's legacy of financial insularity, noting, for example, that at the time, in the Almanac de Gotha, Paraguay was listed as the only country in the world with no public debt. Now, the British novelist's indictment of Paraguay's foolhardy economic insularity and self-sufficiency has deep roots in scholarship on Latin American political history and theory. And again, if there's Latin Americanists in the room, Galeano's book will be a touchstone. During the 1960s, revisionists, influenced by both left-wing dependency theory as well as older right-wing nationalism, especially in Argentina, focused on Britain's role in the region. They cast the War of the Triple Alliance as a plot hatched in London to open an insular and wealthy Paraguay to the international economy, an iconic case of frontier dispossession through the soft colonialism of British capital. With more enthusiasm than evidence, revisionists presented the loans contracted in London by Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil to finance their military expenses as proof of the insidious role of foreign capital. Now, much of this argument rested on a reading of Paraguayan history that portrayed the country's efforts at economic development as a radical and unacceptable challenge to the British and later American model of racial capitalism. James Hudson tracks a parallel early history of US imperial banking, which brought together the internationalism of Wall Street and the US colonial and expansionist projects. This fusion is perhaps best exemplified in the civilizational imaginaries built into the faux Parthenon erected in Wall Street, some of these early banks with their kind of crazy columns. His account of imperial banking in the Americas suggests that Wall Street's, here quoting, neoclassical facade obscured the modern economic aspects of empire, simultaneously expressed imperialism's racial and cultural orders by summoning the interlaced history of finance capitalism and racial capitalism. The creation of a financial frontier as a tactic of imperial expansion reproduced specific racist imaginaries and cultures through which bankers function. The key players in imperial banking were men that Hudson calls rogue bankers. Speaking of great titles, rogue bankers are great ones. Crucially, the methods of imperial banking harnessed by rogue bankers depended equally on the racial logics that organized colonial encounters with people and markets beyond Wall Street, as the unequal flows of capital and expertise that foreign bankers harnessed for their international expansion. So US colonial finance certainly had a role to play in the War of the Triple Alliance. Indeed, it was the otherwise entirely undistinguished President Rutherford B. Hayes who brokered the peace treaty that ended hostilities in 1870. However, it was British banking that was framed by dependency theory, leftist intellectuals, as the decisive source of rogue bankers financing the conflict. Widely popularized by Eduardo Galeano and others in the 1970s, this view of the war retains much popular currency in the region, including in Paraguay. So the argument put forward by Latin American political leftists and both the enthusiasm and evidence marshaled in support of it derived primarily from Paraguay's curious economic history in the middle of the 19th century, which ran against the grain of regional trends in the post-colonial Southern Cone region. So it's worthwhile to backtrack a bit, which I'll do now. Paraguay's first leader after independence, José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, who ruled from 1814 to 1844, recognized the threat posed by Argentina, and particularly the porteños' total monopoly over river transit to the sea, and thus over Paraguay's economic self-determination. So in response, Rodríguez de Francia reoriented the economy of Paraguay inward and threw his energies behind making his nation entirely self-sufficient. This had consequential implications for property regimes. In September of 1825, Francia decreed that all Paraguayans must submit proof of their land ownership by means of documented titles within 3 months. Failure to do so would revert the land to state property. And here I'm drawing on Kleinpenning's kind of famous economic geography of Paraguay. Over half of the land in the more densely settled eastern region and all territories of the remote Chaco became state property in February of 1826. State land increased further through acquisition of Spanish crown estates, expropriation of land belonging to political opponents of the Francia regime, and inheritance of land belonging to foreigners with no Paraguayan-born heirs. The state used this monopoly power over land tenure to establish a large number of estancias in areas that were deemed suitable for livestock farming. And these are kind of massive estates, mostly, again, dedicated to livestock. These massive state-owned interests supplied with, they supplied the army with horses and livestock, provisioned urban areas such as the city of Asunción, the capital, financed state investments in education, and provided livestock for distribution among the poor. So a Republican constitution was drawn up upon the death of Francia in 1844, and power passed to Carlos Antonio López. Very little changed in terms of land tenure, even as López began incorporating industrial production methods in foreign trade. However, while foreign technicians and other experts were welcome, they worked entirely under state direction and control. No private foreign investment was permitted, no loans were raised abroad, and foreigners were banned from land purchases. So in this sense, the kind of depiction of an insular Paraguay was quite accurate. The distinctive aspect of López's mercantilist policies was the violent expropriation of zones of yerba mate and timber cultivation from indigenous communities in 1848. By 1849, nearly all of Eastern Paraguay had passed into state lands. Dominant social groups maintained their privileged status, and they retained rights over land use and cattle stock, while further benefiting from the wealth generated by the mercantilist state. Carlos Antonio López, and here I'm quoting Kleinpenning, became Paraguay's largest private landowner, owned large herds of cattle, and assured himself a princely income, principally through declaring the trade in yerba mate a state monopoly. So in summary, this kind of early period before the war, by the 1860s, nearly all of territorial Paraguay consisted of state-owned land. Prior to 1870, it was not as though rural Paraguay were completely kind of laissez-faire agricultural frontier, or that there was no established notion of ownership regimes. To the contrary, the state, in the form of a small collection of political elite, pursued an active and very specific policy towards land access, focused exclusively on mercantilist production and trade, particularly livestock husbandry on large estates. These were either owned outright by the state or by its political agents, such as Carlos Antonio López. Despite the monopoly power, rural people seemed quite sanguine about the situation, as, again, thinking with Kleinpenning, it seems to have been that many country dwellers, including indígenas, attached little importance to formally recognize ownership of rights in such a thinly populated country, as long as they could continue to use land to grow food through squatting or leasing from the state, and as long as use rights for squatters were respected. When hostilities ended in 1870, Paraguay retained national sovereignty in large part due to tensions within the Allied coalition of victors. And again, this is what Rutherford B. Hayes negotiated. However, vast areas were ceded to Argentina and Brazil during peace negotiations. A puppet government was established by the occupying forces headed by Cirilio Rivarola and Juan Salvador Jovellanos, which immediately set in motion Paraguay's first borrowing on international capital markets. And so this is a long wind up to kind of get to that first point of borrowing, in part to pay reparations for war debts to Argentina and Brazil. Máximo Terreno, former governor of Buenos Aires and son-in-law of famed and famously brutal Argentinian general Juan Manuel de Rosas, leveraged his ties with the commercial banking house Waring Brothers to raise capital on the London bond market. Their brokering firm on the exchange, London-based Robinson Fleming and Company, undertook to place the bonds with the British financial public. So in November of 1871, a prospectus circulated within England's financial community that announced an 8% public works loan of the Republic of Paraguay. The prospectus noted that Paraguay was unable to raise the desired £1 million, and at the time this is a staggering amount of money, on domestic capital markets in the wake of the War of the Triple Alliance and subsequent peace negotiations, but represented the country as peaceful and prosperous. This was followed by a further bond issue of £500,000 in 1872, though more on that to come since this was a contentious issue. The second loan was expected to be issued at a face value of £2 million. The role of bondholders has been widely touted in Britain's 19th century gunboat diplomacy in Latin America, particularly to secure guano in Peru and to enforce debt payments in Venezuela and Santo Domingo. It sometimes took the form of physically seizing customs houses and their revenue streams on behalf of British bondholders. These processes were surely in evidence in the archive of the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders, which is the main source of my material here. That is the basis of kind of my story. A trove of serialized newspaper clippings that were meant to be a resource for potential investors. And I abbreviate the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders as the CFB to kind of give us a bit of shorthand. So the CFB archive is more illuminating in terms of financial knowledge being stabilized for the British investing public than for the traces of militarized intervention. As Mark Flandreau reminds us in his account of the Victorian Stock Exchange and speculative finance, in his words, social sciences that came to be used and valued at this juncture were influenced and commandeered by the stock exchange and its concerns. In particular, Flandreau focuses on the promotion of bubbles through what he calls the art of the puff, another great phrase. Puffing often drew on insights from the emergent sciences and social sciences, entangling scholarship with finance and colonialism. So the same individuals who puffed explorations of Africa or the promotion of mines or railways in Central or Latin America also puffed anthropology. So in this sense, my discipline is kind of complicit with these kind of early maneuvers on the stock exchange. And rampant puffing in turn triggered fierce battles over the ownership of the territories of science. Ownership of learned societies as owners of truth, and the ownership of truth as an instrument for financial deal making. So a lot of this was about the stories that were being told about these faraway places. The ability to shape the way in which the world was known in turn provided the grounds for capitalist accumulation, both through territorial and financial expansion. So the Paraguayan public works loans, as they appeared in the archive, are an extraordinary instance of puffing, since they came in the aftermath of a devastating conflict while making outsized promises about the economic conditions that would make debt service possible. Indeed, an article in the British Daily Recorder humphed over the speculative promises encoded in the first foreign loans. And here kind of they write a couple of years later after default, there is no Paraguay as a nation. The men, even the horses, were all dead. They fell fighting for a shadow of the independence of their country, as represented by Lopez, a cruel tyrant, their president. But they died bravely and left the lands fertile, cultivated, and harvest-bearing to anyone who had come and occupy them. That is what the Paraguayan loan was raised for, and it was raised and paid over to the government, but what was done with it? So the sort of idea of kind of cultivated virgin lands that are just available and waiting there for a savvy investor to come and work was a key kind of image that circulated in the archive. On the basis of Paraguay's fertile, cultivated, and harvest-bearing land, the 1871 and 1872 prospectus ultimately led to the successful issue of bonds on by the London firm Robinson Fleming and Company. So one might wonder, meanwhile, how post-conflict Paraguay, decimated as it was by the war and its ensuing genocidal demographic collapse, with fewer than 30,000 adult men, were estimated to have survived the conflict of a pre-war population of between 600 and 800,000. So how they would be in a position to make coupon payments in specie for a large foreign loan. Economic geographers of Paraguay suggest that the 1870s saw a large-scale liquidation of state-owned land, beginning with small-scale sales and escalating with successively higher limits. And since the government needed money quickly, partly to make coupon payments on its foreign debt, payments for even small parcels had to be made entirely in gold and silver, for any parcels over 20 cuadras, partially in gold and silver. Consequently, the land went mostly to foreigners who had access to gold and silver specie. Although land sale was not very successful at first, it did result in the first foreign-owned latifundios, or estates. So these efforts to raise funds by alienating large areas of state-owned land were largely unsuccessful. And by the 1874, following several pages of interest payment notices in the archive, a printed notice stated that Paraguay had not sent the necessary funds for to its financial representatives in London to make its May 1874 coupon payment. The financier characterized the situation as, quote, disastrous but not unexpected. The rhetorical efficacy of the serial list of coupon payments and debt service contrasted powerfully against notice of default, providing a really kind of potent statement about what could be expected or not of Paraguay. So from here, we have a sort of story of kind of debt and default that is quite similar to kind of many instances of default in kind of Latin America. So here I want to kind of dive into the 1871 and 1872 loans to think about what was going on with these logics of settlement that weren't quite as visible in kind of simply the payment records, or if we sort of focus on kind of the payment records as they appear in the archive. So the 1871 loan was a bonanza for the syndicate led by Waring Brothers and for Robinson Fleming and Company, the brokers. The bonds were discounted, so they're priced at kind of 80 for the face value of a £100 bond to make them more appealing to investors. And Waring had to account with the sort of 8% kind of interest rate, had to account for only £64 of the face value of the bonds. They also used the difference to engage in the speculative practice of buying back the bonds, a common kind of speculative, which was common to the speculative bubble of Latin American debt at the time. So the syndicate made a profit of just over £128,000, of which Waring Brothers took about £60,000. This only left 400,000 of the £1 million issue for Paraguay, and then sort of that sort of money mostly went to the occupying elite of the caretaker government. The success of the loan for the syndicate and for the brokerage firm inspired President Jovellanos to bring out that second bond issue. So that would be the 1872 loan. And it was initially meant to have the face value of £2 million. So overall, the kind of aim was £3 million in very short order on the stock exchange. The bonds for the 1872 bond issue completely tanked. By June, when it was kind of coming out, a series of defaults had spooked investors and burst the speculative bubble in Latin American debt. Only a fraction of the proposed amount was actually placed to the bond holding public, just over £500,000. And this was kind of seen as a catastrophe for the brokering firm. So what did Terrero do, the kind of head of Waring Brothers and the syndicate? So the syndicate kind of came up with a plan. There's always a plan. They sought to link the bond issue directly to a wild emigration scheme to Paraguay in an effort to puff the bonds and raise their profile within financial circles, even going so far as to earmark part of the proceeds of the bonds to finance the scheme. Robinson, Fleming and Company took a direct hand in the plan, so this wasn't sort of at arm's length. In fact, John and George Fleming were appointed as consul and vice consul in London to Paraguay. The plan turned on recruiting British colonists, charged £25 per adult, $5 for children per passage, and allocating the title of a deed of land in the amount of 40 acres, with an additional 20 acres per child over the age of 14. 2 weeks rations were provided for free, after which provisions, farm animals and equipments would be supplied at cost and financed at 5% interest. So these were the famous Lincolnshire Farmers. As Andrew Nixon, the historian and preeminent expert on Paraguayan politics, whose account I've been leaning on heavily here, observes, the colonists came to be known as these Lincolnshire farmers for rather obscure reasons. They were, however, by no means farmers. Nixon's exhaustive biography of the colonists suggests that most were urban artisans. So shoemakers, carpenters, cooks, waiters, bricklayers, blacksmiths, locksmiths, barbers, and so on. With 2 ships departing in October and 1 in December, an estimated 892 colonists set out for Paraguay. Nixon's account of the travails faced by the immigrants upon reaching Paraguay is fascinating. And I encourage you to read his kind of essay. There's a link here that he produced for Canning House on this forgotten chapter of British Latin American relations. But for our purposes, 2 crucial details stand out. First, that both the Jovellanos government and Robinson Fleming and Company immediately washed their hands of the scheme. You can see the scheme advertised here, but it was very short-lived. And they washed their hands of it once it became clear that it was not succeeding as a marketing ploy for the 1872 bond issue on the exchange. And second, a legal dispute between the newly arrived minister plenipotentiary, who denied that Paraguay had ever authorized the scheme. So his conflict with Robinson Fleming and Company froze the funds allocated to support the colonists. This came at a tragic time as their crops had failed and they faced dangers from the continuing political violence in the countryside. Recall it's still only 2 years after the cessation of hostilities following the war. So Nixon's account of the colonists' plight is revealing. As their situation worsened, help was still not forthcoming from the financial backers of the scheme. The surviving colonists made a desperate attempt to reach Asunción and from there seek safe passage to Buenos Aires in Argentina. A letter to the British charge d'affaires in Buenos Aires pleading for help saw an outpouring of charity from the St. Patrick Benevolent Society, which raised 1,800 pounds in very short order. By October of 1873, so a mere year after this whole scheme was cooked up, nearly all of the survivors had been brought downriver to settle in Argentina. So a year later, in 1874, Paraguay failed to pay the coupons for both the 1871 loans and entered into default. In 1875, Robinson Fleming and Company fronted Parliament for an inquiry about the speculative bubble in the early 70s, but revealed that though their actions were reprehensible, they were entirely in keeping with the financial practices at the time. As Harris Gaylord Warren concludes, they stayed within the law mainly because there was so little law to stay within. So historians of Paraguay, such as Nixon and Warren, have told this story from the perspective of the intimate tragedies of the hapless Lincolnshire farmers who found themselves caught in the turning gears of imperial finance in the search for people to boom a loan, and of peculation and greed from the rogue bankers that profited from the financial frontier while bearing responsibility for none of its very real human costs. While this is certainly a tragedy, casting the syndicate and brokers as villains of the story sidesteps a wider conceptual question about the logics of settlement and ownership that animate both the loan and the colonization scheme. While the violence of frontier expansion in settler colonial context has been well documented, what is notable about this case is that it hinged on a process of disoccupation. In fact, of evacuation and rescue, of unsettling, rather than conventional territorial logics of settlement and its related ideologies of racial capitalism. Here, financial agents and political operatives were more interested in removing the poor dupes who, in their view, were foolish enough to misrecognize a financial operation for a claim of ownership. They were packed off to Buenos Aires, paving the way for terra nullius to be declared again and again, as if for the first time. And here thinking with Melinda Cooper and her kind of work on more recent financialization. Importantly, while in other settler colonial contexts, and here again from Melinda Cooper, in the frontier, the household attained a plasticity and portability that confounded European understandings of empire and flight. What is at stake in financialization is the deterritorialization and reterritorialization of the household as a site of legitimized reproduction. So I think the Paraguayan bonds may reveal a limit case to this logic of ownership, the household that eternally slips from view as a mirage that makes land endlessly available for speculative finance because it's never quite actually settled or occupied. In the extreme, settling debt means unsettling territory and a disavowal of even the minimal obligations entailed by ownership. So I'm going to kind of play this forward to see what happens with this logic of ownership that involves kind of depopulating the estates that were the subject of financial speculation. For the remainder of my talk, I'll follow this idea of unsettling the frontier, of terra nullius being constantly declared as if for the first time, of emptiness rather than occupancy as the animating logic of speculative finance. Despite the prior efforts to raise funds for the 1874 coupon payment through the property sale, a further prospectus appeared shortly after in 1875. So this is when Paraguay is in default. They're not able to pay for their existing sovereign debt and are being pilloried in the archive and in the kind of wider British media. So in 1875, this prospectus emerged, advertising a new type of speculative land deal. The prospectus advertises shares in the River Plate Land and Trading Company Limited. The company sought to raise £500,000 for the purpose of, and this is directly from the prospectus, of purchasing and working the extensive estates for the properties thereon and therein, lately belonging to Lopez, the deceased president of Paraguay, with all concessions, privileges, and rights belonging thereto. This was not sovereign debt contracted by Paraguay, like the public works loans of 1871 and 1872. Instead, this was a venture contracted, organized by British capitalists seeking investment opportunities abroad. The nature of the venture itself only hinted obliquely at the ways in which the opportunity to purchase this extensive estates arose. The prospectus notes, and this is again quoting directly from what's being sort of put forth to investors, they say the conclusion of the war with the fall of the Lopez dynasty has now for the first time opened this country to foreign enterprise and its enormous internal resources, which enabled it to maintain entire commercial independence, its exports being double as imports, and sustained long and ruinous wars. Present to the capitalists rare prospects and advantages, seldom equaled and certainly never surpassed by those of any other country. So indeed, the prospectus, casting in glowing terms the capacity of Paraguay to wage war is kind of evidence of its kind of resourcefulness and resource-rich kind of landscapes. Meanwhile, the prospectus does not name the vendors of the estate. Although the document noted that the Lopez dynasty had fallen, the political status of Paraguayan authority over those lands was unclear. And indeed, it was not until November 1875 that legislation permitting sales up to a maximum value of 6 million pesos was even passed in Paraguay. So the prospectus notes under the terms of purchase, a favorable contract has been made with the vendors for the purchase of these extensive and valuable possessions, with all concessions, rights, and privileges and franchises connected therewith, with £150,000 to be paid as follows: £100,000, therefore, to be paid upon be paid up with shares with the vendors to agree to retain for 12 months after their allotment, and £50,000 in money. So a big portion of the payment was to be taken in shares that the vendors would hold for 12 months. What is striking here is that those paid up shares of the company served as payments for the vendors under the terms of purchase. Land is situated as always already an asset class. This theory of ownership was crucial to the specific form that the property sale took, and implicated the Paraguayan partner in further iterative chains of speculative deals, in the sense that the vendors came to be in possession of company shares and were expected to trade them on after the stipulated year, thus stitching together the post-war Paraguayan economy to British capital markets through a joint stock company. The art of puffing had the practical effect of recalibrating ownership in terms of financial settlement, so the temporalities of contract, rather than settlement in terms of occupancy and production. So this is where the contradictory meaning of settlements were particularly evident, in the sense that the logics of ownership through occupancy, when applied to the vendor, were used to justify the financial settlement through shareholding in the River Plate Land and Trading Company. The latter both presupposed and entailed the former. Indeed, in this curious slippage, the report acknowledges, here you can sort of follow along, it's impossible to refer to Paraguay without recalling the prejudices created by the position of the loan so recently brought out. But so far as the project now before us is concerned, it must be noted that a legitimate private enterprise in what is now acknowledged as one of the River Plate republics under the protection of Brazil has nothing in common with past state intrigues, and Paraguayan bondholders have a direct interest in furthering the legitimate development of the country's wealth. So the recent history of Paraguay hinges on the scandal of default and the subsequent reclamations of British bondholders, at least in kind of this framing. The status of the prejudices, however, emerges from the Chronicle of Debt Service as envisaged by the cessation of coupon payments, rather than myriad other prejudices recently experienced by Paraguay, such as, for example, its occupation, or rather protection, by Brazil. So a note on the ethics and aesthetics of the archive. The form of the bondholder scrapbook makes visible the suspension of debt service. So that's what figures here in the report. The serial list of bonds drawn for payment notably does not appear after 1874, but it doesn't chronicle other prejudices, such as the legislative struggle over the conditions of liquidating public land holdings and legitimating foreign investment for the first time. The economic chronology that's kind of characterized by the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders, although its purpose to include all information that might be useful to members of the investing public, brackets questions of national sovereignty and territorial integrity in favor of a capacious account of financial transactions. So in 1875, the same year that the River Plate Land and Trading Company circulated its prospectus, a parliamentary commission in London was charged with investigating loans floated under suspicious circumstances, including the Paraguayan public debt. So kind of as this kind of land deal was taking shape, a kind of look back was taking place in terms of those loans that were floated in 1871 and 1872. The commission revealed that the completeness of accounting is at work in regimenting Paraguay's debt service, or kind of lack thereof, was not exactly like on the same page with the fluctuations and disjuncture that structure the lending market in England. So even though Paraguay was on the hook for these kind of bonds, there were all sorts of kind of gaps that characterized the lending market itself. The problem with these loans and the irregularities that brought bond trading to the attention of Parliament was that the books were not even squared until special settling days, where all accounts were reconciled at the exchange and gains and losses were tallied and compared. So this is kind of a part of the reporting on those commissions. The Financier of London published a full transcript of the hearings on bond trading. In direct questioning, Mr. Fleming of the famous Robinson Fleming and Company, the brokerage firm that floated the Paraguayan loans and set in motion this disastrous immigration scheme, admitted it's impossible to tell until the end of the settlement, day of settlement, what the result of the bear and seller operations will be. He acknowledged that his firm bought back a great deal of the stock to counteract the operations of the bears, the sellers, to prevent the loan from being depreciated by lax speculative sales. When asked if, in short, the buying back was to inspire the public with the same confidence that you yourselves entertained, Mr. Fleming replied very casually, "No, not exactly. Not exactly, no. It was done to counteract the influences of speculative sales. We should not have issued the loan had we not had confidence in it. Recall that the difference between 64 and the issue price of 85 was to cover expenses." So the profits of Robinson Fleming and Company derived from their capacity to identify these spaces where obligation was unclear or asymmetrical. So he was decidedly vague on his level of confidence in the Paraguayan loan, discussing it instead in terms of the financial techniques deployed by his firm. Their profit emerged, in other words, from a frontier that's internal to the British bond market, one marked by its own particular modes of settlement and expropriation. So Paraguay's entanglement with the public works loans of 1871 and 1872 did not end with the parliamentary investigation, revealing widespread fraud, profiteering, inveterate speculation. The obligation persisted, and Paraguay was barred from further borrowing on the British capital markets until the debt was resolved. So it was sort of lingering there and keeping them from any further borrowing. For decades, the bonds languished in default, and Paraguay could not borrow on European capital markets. Provisional resolutions for debt restructuring were discussed in the late 1870s, most of which featured consolidating the existing loans with a new loan in tandem with ceding land in Paraguay to British bondholders to indemnify them for unpaid interest. And we can see these here. The conversion loan, which was finalized on the London Exchange in 1885, featured large land transfers to British interests in conjunction with debt restructuring, as the 1871 and 1872 loans were converted into new 1885 bonds with accompanying land titles. The new investment vehicle, Land Warrants, were a key aspect of the debt refinancing and indemnified bondholders for interest arrears. In this case, settlement of the public debt hinged on the prior settlement of the deal linking unspecified vendors with shares of the River Plate Land and Trading Company, which normalized land not only as an investment opportunity, as Paraguay's attempt at liquidating agricultural land suggested, but one delinked from settlement and occupation. The mercantilist estates populated by cattle and yerba mate were beside the point. So the land warrants generated a further speculative venture, the Paraguay Land Company, that began buying up the warrants from holders of the 1871 and 1872 public works loans. The primary aim of the Paraguay Land Company was to acquire in exchange for shares in the company all or any of the land warrants issued by the Republic of Paraguay for the lands given in discharge of the interest arrears for the loans that the Republic issued in London in 1871 and 1872, under the arrangement with the bondholders of those loans, ratified by the laws of Congress in Paraguay on the 16th of March, 1886. So the end result is a kind of long windup of this process of financial settlement that rendered land always already financialized was that vast tracts of Paraguayan territory, already diminished by Argentine and Brazilian claims after the war, came to be nominal property of British financial speculators. Indeed, the settlement in 1885 publicized the concession of land thusly. The holders of such warrants shall be entitled forthwith, or at any time within 6 years of the present date, to explore any or all of the fiscal or public lands of the state referred to in the preceding article, and to select therefrom the lands to be conceded as aforesaid in exchange for the land warrants. So just to kind of note here, the prospectus for the land company puffs the venture some more, making all sorts of promises about developing the land, investing in all sorts of social goods, schools, etc. None of this actually happened, of course, but it's kind of there as part of the kind of spruiking the scheme. So in a statement from the Buenos Aires Standard, perhaps best summarizes the complex temporalities of settlement, holding together liquidation with enduring obligation. They say, the theory that a bond never dies has been fully borne out by the notice which we give at foot, and the history of the Paraguayan debt, which is too long for us to now repeat. That notice that they give is that Paraguay is now refinanced its debt. Suffice it to say that these Paraguayan bonds, which but a few years ago were hardly worth the paper on which they were printed, are now a quotable security on the London Stock Exchange. And as appears by the notice referred to, which we cut from the Times, the coupon which fell due on the 1st of the present year has been paid, and land warrants for the back interest handed over to bondholders. The refinancing of Paraguay's sovereign debt also settled one question of property. The value of land was made commensurate with interest payments for the bonds and used to indemnify bondholders for their losses. This form of settlement hinged on the value of quotable securities and opportunities presented by the speculative zeal of settling days for stock jobbers on the London Stock Exchange. This could all happen without a single prospector actually settling in Paraguay and extracting resources from the land that they now putatively owned. By this point, even the mirage of Lincolnshire farmers to puff the securities were unnecessary. The settler colonial logic of the financial frontier unspooled entirely independently of land occupancy. So what happened? What actually happened with all of that land, after all? The National Statistical Annuary of 1914 offers the following illustrative snapshot. So vast amounts of land were sold, over 12,000 square miles. And of those, only 479 square miles were surrendered to holders of Paraguayan bonds in London. Meanwhile, 80 square miles were given away mostly to peasants, and 807 square miles of yerbales were sold. So only a fraction of those post-war land sales entailed lands implicated in the land warrants that indemnified British bondholders. However, settlement of the 1871 and 1872 loans, the creation of the land company, and the subsequent land warrants entailed settlement of land as an asset class, as the creation of companies that traded shares or land titles went hand in glove with efforts to service the public debt. So by the early 20th century, large latifundias, which you can see in crosshatch here, were owned by a handful of foreign investors who, for the most part, never actually set foot or even took an interest in their holdings. According to Frutos, a payment order issued in Europe was all that was needed to become a large landowner in Paraguay. In a sense, we see the inverse of the extractivism decried by the Latin American intellectual left in dependency theory. What was extracted was financial value and the extension of British financial markets across the colonial world. While cattle and horses and timber and yerba mate were exported by a multi-species mercantilist public in the pre-war period and widely consumed by the European manufacturing centers, the expansion of the financial frontier entailed a curious inversion. The smallholders who'd hitherto leased small plots from the state or who asserted use rights over the land in post-independence Francia regime were summarily moved off these large latifundios when it was settled as an asset class on the London Exchange. Their titles and leaseholding were abrogated by the new modality of ownership, and most moved into densely populated prairie urban core around the capital. Competition for land intensified, even as giant latifundios were largely unproductive. Through a cruel irony, financial settlement entailed unsettling the productive rural economies of cattle and yerba. As Kleinpenning noted, most Paraguayan timber and yerba mate producers had to abandon their enterprises because the sale of the state forests and yerbales to foreigners, and many small and medium-sized cattle farmers found themselves in difficulty because they were often no longer pastures available for them to rent. So far from an effort to open up the resources and wealth of Paraguay for neo-colonial extraction, the financial frontier eclipsed the settler colonial logic of occupation in favor of contractual settlement and stock jobbing. So it's not that dependency theory here is wrong, it's just that it takes a simplistic notion of resource extraction as a starting point. So I promise I'm wrapping up now, since we're kind of well at our time. I'm going to briefly talk about 21st century transformations and why an ethnographer would be kind of curious about this financial archive. So by way of conclusion, I'll briefly gesture now to how this account fits with my ethnography of contemporary agrarian life in Paraguay, and particularly new rounds of climate financing that are effectively selling weather derivatives to campesinos. In part, this deep dive into the financial archives helps me explain why sesame farmers have 1 to 4 hectares, only 1 to 4 hectares, to plant niche cereals. So a legacy of highly unequal land distribution that came out of this moment of financial settlement. This offered an opportunity for new rounds of financial speculation, including the index-based agricultural insurance, or parametric insurance, as it's popularly called. This is the topic of my book, which is specifically geared to the microplots of land. And the idea here is that rather than sending an insurance adjuster out to kind of look at your crop losses, instead it would use climate modeling based on a weather index to kind of trigger the derivative if a certain weather event happens. And that saves the work of having to kind of go out and actually look, see, who's there on the land, what happened, how many sesames died, etc. So what's peculiar about the weather derivatives is that they're marketed as a technological innovation. So weather models, satellites, weather stations for remote communities that are difficult to access by insurance adjusters. And as I document elsewhere, this is a financial maneuver that also bears a tenuous relationship to ownership and occupancy of land, since the tiny plots of land are insured through remote sensing and a weather index, yet again decoupling the actual experience of farmers' fields and crops from the financial value that they're abstracted into a grid square on the map. This in turn opens a spigot of international pools of capital through access to the global reinsurance market for local insurance providers. In sum, thinking financial frontiers from the perspective of Paraguayan land as an asset class on international markets first challenges us to rethink the specificity of the values of ownership and property through the active process of settling and unsettling, rather than through the biography of the settler. And two, it invites us to recalibrate our spatial imaginary of the frontier. It's not the green desert of Paraguayan forests narrated through the travails of bedraggled colonists or intrepid households, but a series of internal frontiers produced and inhabited by specific financial actors, rogue bankers, who are hardly rogue at all, and the investor publics that they puff. This gives us useful tools, I think, to understand, for instance, why so many Sydney apartments are empty, and why we see the reconstitution of the frontier as the space in which debt can be accumulated. If that doesn't have you worrying about impending rate hikes, I don't know what will. So, thank you.
I'm just recovering from my shock about the last